Yeah. Okay. I said we're going to start talking about fish. The fish that I'm going to talk about today is a fish that made a major controversy between Hungarian Rabbanim. But even more than that, it's a fish that almost made controversy as to what the truth is. What the truth is exactly had like multiple meanings, depending who you ask. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The simanim, fish have fins and scales, that we know from the Torah, right? Fish have fins and scales. Now fish, there's many different kinds of scales that fish could have. There are like translucent scales, there are scales that are layered on top of each other, there are round ones, there are diamond-shaped scales, and they all, like according to science, they all function very differently. But according to halacha, all the various types of scales are kind of irrelevant as long as there's scales. There's many different types of fins on a fish, right? There's pectoral fins, there's, what's the fin on its back called? That's the fin that all the big fish have. There's tail fin, dorsal fins, tail fins, exactly. But for the most part, according to most Rishonim Akapanim, all these various different kinds of fins are irrelevant in halacha, provided that it has fins. It's considered a kosher fish. Now, each one of these things has some shittas that make it important. L'mashal, there's a riyaz that says that the scales on the back, the fins on the back of fish, so by a predatory fish, like a shark, for example, they have a very tall back of the tail fin, and the bottom of the tail fin is much shorter. It's like not even, the thing. So the riyaz says that any fish that has an uneven tail fin is a treifa fish. Kosher fish have even tail fins, he says, for example. Or there's many other, little, day chidas, one sheet and a rishon here, sheet and a rishon there, that say different, simanim for a fish. But overall, the basic simanim for a fish, we know, are fins and scales. So now, l'chayra, there shouldn't be much makim for grace and machleksim. I mean, of all things that are kosher, fish is the most basic. The Torah says in the pasuk, you could eat if it has fins and scales, you're allowed to eat it, which is very simple. We know you don't have to have a Messiah for fish. The Shulchan Aruch and Siman Yud Gimel says fish don't need shchita. Fish should be a very, very simple food to eat. It shouldn't be very complicated. Basically, anybody could ascertain what a kosher fish is. So how did this get so complicated? So, as follows. In Hungary, in the Danube River, and it's not just there, they're primarily in Russia, they're a little bit in Turkey, there are a ton of sturgeon. Now, sturgeon is where caviar comes from. It's a very, very valuable fish. A high-quality sturgeon that can produce real caviar is a very, very valuable fish, but that's for rich people. There's a small sturgeon, a family, a cousin of sturgeon, called the sterlit. It's a small fish that's similar to sturgeon, called the sterlit. And the sterlit fish is like a sturgeon, but not exactly like a sturgeon. And the sterlit fish was widely available in the river, in the Danube, for people to have. And that became a shaila, and I'll tell you why. What do you say? It produces caviar also. Yeah, it's a caviar-producing fish too, so it makes it somewhat valuable, but it's not as expensive as a full-grown sturgeon. Now, the problem is as follows: in parts of Hungary, there was two kehilas in parts of Hungary. In parts of Hungary before I think 1750 was controlled by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire. So Mamela, a lot of Sephardim migrated down into certain parts of Hungary and lived there, like in the Banet region, in the Tokay region, even in the capital of Budapest. There was a lot of Sephardim who lived there. Then, over time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire came into power, and in the mid-1700s, they took it over, and the border closed between the Ottoman Empire, between the Turkish, the Sephardim, and between Ashkenazim. What was left behind was communities that were like a mix of some Sephardim and some Ashkenazim. Ad Kedei Kach, let's say in Tamashav, where this Shaila first arose, in Tamashav, where the Shaila first arose, there was you see from all the letters that people are writing, there was a community board that was comprised of some members of the Sephardic community, some members of the Ashkenazi community, and together they set community policy, which was unique. Mostly in communities you didn't have. They had either a Sephardic kilo or Ashkenazi kilo, and if there was a small, kilo that was there with it, they didn't have much of a say. Over here, they both had a say together. Now, in Turkey, the minig was to eat the sterlit fish. The sterlit fish in Turkey was considered a kosher fish. And Sephardim, who were of Turkish origin, would eat the sterlit without a problem. The Shemesh Tzaka, who's a Sephardi Pesach, a Sephardi Tshuva from the early 1700s, who was against eating the sterlit fish, writes that the minig is that they eat this fish. So in the Sephardi Kila, the minig was to eat the sterlit fish without a problem. Now, Ashkenazi kila, the minig always was, let's say in the rest of, Ashkenazic Jewry in Poland or elsewhere, they did not eat the sterlet fish. Sterlet fish was not something you would eat. So you had kehilas like Tamashava, where in the fish market, there was Sephardi fish and Ashkenazi fish, meaning it was different fish that would be bought for different people there. And this led to some confusion and some problems, till the kehila of Tamashav was petitioning their Rav to please be makel for us, to let us eat sterlet. My neighbors, I don't know, you pick a name, next door, they have sterlet on Shabbos and it looks very delicious, and I want to have sterlet on Shabbos too, and how come only Svardim could have? I want to have too. So they petitioned their Rav, and the first Rav on record that we know who was asked about it was the Rav of Tamashav. His name was Rav Yechanan. I don't know his last names weren't so important. Rav Yechanan of Tamashav was asked the Shaila, could Ashkenazim eat sterlet fish as well? And Rav Yechanan of Tamashav says that no, he says, there's no makom to be paired together, you can't eat sterlet, it's treif, can't have it. Okay? He dies, a new Rav takes over, and his name the new Rav's name was, Tzvi Segel. Tzvi Segel was the new Rav, a Talmud of Yehuda, a Litvish person, Ashkenazi, not a Litvish, Ashkenazi person, and they come to him and they say, hey, new Rav, maybe you could be makel for us that we could eat sterlet. We want to have sterlet. And he says, this is a grace of Shaila, it's a little bit above my pay grade, I don't think I can answer this, but I'll write to my Rebbe, the Noda B'Yehuda, and I'll see what he says. And here's where the firestorm starts. The Noda B'Yehuda, in Yeridei Tinyana Tshuva Chavches, it's not a very long tshuva. Noda B'Yehuda says as follows. He says, Mechtavi Higiyani Machras Yom Kippurim. I got your package, Moitzi Yom Kippur. The letter that Noda B'Yehuda sent back is dated Yud Gimel Tishrei. So he got it, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis. He sends it back Yud Gimel Tishrei. And he said, Im Hadag, the package, the shaila came together with a fish, with a sample fish. There wasn't as many standards for mail. The package came, there was a sterlet fish in it, with the letter asking, what would be the din with this fish? Then Yehuda says, he says, and the shaila was, Vina Shashal, your shaila was, Im Lismech ala Eidos, Hameidim Ha'ichlon B'Mekayimam. Could you be made on the Eidot, the groups, meaning the Svardim who say that where we come from back home in Turkey, or Greece, wherever we come from, we eat this fish. Could you be samech on those groups telling you that you eat it? So it says the Noda B'Yehuda, like being samech nemanis, no, that's not going to work over here. He's not going to go into that. But he says, Amnam, Anina Sisi, he says, I did a test on this fish. I tested it to see if it's a kosher fish. He says, V'yesh le shtei shuras kaskasim. I was able to see that it has two thin strips of kaskasim. Now, sturgeon are, for the most part, a flat fish. If you look at a picture later, you'll see sturgeon have very smooth skin, flat skin. But he says, I isolated that there are two little strips of kaskasim that run along the sturgeon fish. He says, B'tzad yamin v'shurachad b'tzad smol. There's one strip of them on the right, one strip of them on the left. U'ma b'kach she'ein neklafim b'yad. He says, now here, he addresses what the issue is. He says, and what with it if they don't come off by hand? Now right here is where the issue starts. The sturgeon scales, even though they have a certain amount of scales on the right and the left, they don't come off by hand. If you take, just a hand and try to brush it off, it won't come off. You take, let's say, a salmon, for example, it's very easy to get the scales off. With like a little bit of brushing, with take a credit card and brush it against the skin, you're going to get the scales off. So he says, ma'bekach, that they don't come off. They do come off with the utensil. If I take a scale peeler, I could get them to come off. He says, he says, I soaked them in a chemical bath. I put it in a chemical bath first, for 3 hours, and then he says, niklafim biyad. Then they were able to come off by hand. But meaning the Noda B'Yehuda loosened up the skin by putting on some sort of solution, some sort of solvent, the gugan of the day, and he put it for a 3-hour bath in gugan, and then the scales came right off. So it says the Noda B'Yehuda, that's fine. He says now Uladaiti, he says, okay, now I just want to let's pause right here and give the halachic context, the halachic background for what's going on over here. So the shaila is really as follows: the Gemara in Chulin. The Mishnah in Chulin tells us fish are nechal as long as they have snapper kaskasas. As long as the Torah says, as long as they have fins and scales. That's what the Gemara in Chulin says. The Mishnah in Chulin. Now the Gemara in Daf Samach Vavam and Beis brings as follows: Tanan Hasam. The Gemara says, Kol sheyeshloi kaskasas yeshloi snapper. Anything that has kaskasas, any fish that has scales, automatically you could be batuach. It has fins. And this would mean that if you find a piece of fish, with the skin attached to it, you have no idea what type of fish it's from, and it has scales on the outside, and they're scales that are, real scales, and even if you have no idea what type of fish it is, and you don't see the fins, good to go, you could eat that fish. So the Gemara goes back and forth, and the Gemara says, if that's such a simple fact, that anything that has kaskeses, anything that has scales, automatically has snapir, it has a fin. So what's the point in the Torah saying snapir and kaskeses? Why is the Torah saying two simanim? So it says the Gemara, Yagdal Torah v'yader. No answer. Like Yagdal Torah v'yader, yeah, just be marbe, there's more simanim, there's more to talk about. And the Rishonim asked that normally Yagdal Torah v'yader means there's some favarf and a nafkamina. There's some crazy nafkamina. Over here we can't even think of a really nafkamina, but the Gemara says Yagdal Torah v'yader. Now, additionally, and this one is a little less relevant, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah first of all, the Gemara of Avodah Zarah in the Flamates brings with Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva was once presented with a fish that did not have any readily available scales. He didn't see any scales. Rabbi Akiva took it outside to the sunlight, he held it up, and he saw in the glint of the sun, you could see some sort of scales, and he said kosher. The Gemara brings similar criteria where the Gemara basically isolates and says that scales are like a bare minimum. If it has any type of thin layer of scales, it's good enough. If it has maybe 1, 2, or even 3 scales, good enough. The Gemara has machlekes if there's a specific location on the body, it's good enough. The Gemara is very makel about all the simanim of kaskeses came out on the fish. Now the Gemara in Chulin on Daf Mem brings one more criteria of kosher fish, and this became involved in the shilos. I'll just say it. The Gemara brings one more criteria. The Gemara says that a kosher fish has a rosh v'shedra, a head and a spine, like a visible head and a spine, as opposed to a not kosher fish doesn't have a head and a spine. Now, what exactly that means from a scientific standpoint is not so super clear, but the Gemara itself jumps up and asks the obvious question. The Gemara says, what do you mean? The Mishnah in Chulin says, it says fins and scales. It doesn't say a word about spines and heads. It doesn't say any of these things. So the Gemara gives two terutzim. The Gemara says, either this is only a kula litful b'tziron. This kula that the Gemara in Avodah Zarah is saying is only if you found a bucket of fish yach, kachenyu, what's it called? Fish kachenyu maybe, and you're not sure what type of fish it comes from, and attached to it is the head and the spine of a fish, you could be seimich that this fish yach comes from a kosher fish, and you could dip in it. But to eat the fish itself, that you can't do, based on just the simanim of a head and a spine. The other teretz the Gemara says is no, there are exceptions. Head and a spine is not conclusive. There are not kosher fish that also display these simanim, and the only way to really, really isolate what's a kosher fish is with snapper and kaskeses. Now there's a great machlekes rishonim, and I don't want to get lost in the weeds of it, but there's a big machlekes rishonim if one could be seimech lemaisa on just the head and the spine to eat a fish that you find. But b'chaleifin, by the time it makes it to Shulchan Aruch, it's very simple. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Pei Gimel, Shulchan Aruch says as follows. Simanei dagim mefurashim b'Torah. Simanei dagim, straight up, it's mefurash in the Torah. Kol sheyesh le snapir v'kaskeses, anything that has a snapir v'kaskeses, mutter. Says the Shulchan Aruch, v'snapir hu sheshat by, it means a fin that's used for swimming, V'kaskeses, scales, hena klipas hakvuyis by. That means the scales that are kavua on the skin of the fish. Now, here's where this is the monkey wrench. Here's a one line in the Ramah. Ramah says as follows, Haga, v'dafka, Shem neklafim bayad. Dafka, if the kaskeses is able to be peeled by hand. Oy bekli, or with a keli. Aval miyefshel lekolfa me'ar hadag. If you're not able to rip it off the ar hadag, it doesn't separate. Loy mikri kaskeses. That's not called a kaskeses. Now, so where does this come from? So the Gemara doesn't say this. The Gemara in Chulin, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, none of the Gemaras say this special criteria that the kaskeses has to be something that you could peel by hand or with a keli. So where does it come from? It comes from a Ramban al Torah. That's the Makar. The Beis Yosef brings it down from there, and that's where the Ramah draws it from. There's a Ramban al Torah. Ramban al Torah says, the pasuk says, "Ezet toichlu mikol asher b'mayim, kol asher ein le'snaper v'kaskeses b'mayim b'yamim b'nacholem oisem toichlu, kol asher ein le'snaper v'kaskeses that you can't eat sheketz ulechem." That's the pasuk. Says the Ramban. The Ramban says, "Leitavin milishoinam." From the Chazal used the pasuk of Assyrian kaskasim. Chazal used different psukim to describe how the kaskeses is attached to the body of the fish. Says the Ramban, "Leitavin milishoinam." Don't understand from Chazal shein kfuyim begufan mamish v'dvukim ba'ar hadag, that they're mamish connected and bound to the skin of the ar hadag. Aval kruyim kvuyim she'enam nadim mimenu v'lei mizazim b'kesnapir. They're called kavua only in contrast to the fins. Fins are something that move around. They're constantly, they're bendable, they're moving around. So scales, he says, are called kavuim only in contrast to snapir. Scales are kavua, they don't move around. They're not a movable part. It's like a keratin type of material that's on the outside of the fish. Says the Rambam, but there's something that comes off easily with a hand or a knife. Avokal kavua v'davuk ba'ar hadag ve'inu neder min ha'ar klal. Says the Rambam, anything that's so kavua that it's not able to be separated from the skin with a hand or a keli, eine kaskeses. Ubalav, and its bearer, the fish that carries it, the fish that wears it, asru, is a fish that's asr. Ulechein amru b'gemara, the kaskeses levushu. He says that's why the Gemara refers to kaskeses as a levush, a clothing. Clothing is meant to come on and off. Clothing is not part of your skin. It comes on, it comes off. Says the Ramban that based on his understanding of the Gemara, his diak in the Gemara, he invents a new rule. That kaskeses has to be something that's able to come on and off easily. Something that's mamish bound to the skin of the fish is not called kaskeses. That's what the Ramban says. Now the Beis Yosef brings this down, and from there the Ramah draws it, and the Ramah paskins like it in Shulchan Aruch, like we saw, that anything that's not niklafim easily, biyad or b'kli, is aser. So now let's circle back to the sterlit. So the sterlit fish is a fish that has scales. Like we see that Yehuda writes about his field test, it has scales. The sterlit has a certain amount of scales on both sides of it. But the problem is the scales don't come off easily. They're very hard to get them off. The scales don't come off. Now, sturgeon itself, like the fish that's not kosher, sturgeon, the reason why the scales don't come off is because there's a layer of skin on the outside on top of the scales. Meaning the scales are not the first layer of skin. There's like a translucent layer of skin on top of the fish, then there's the scales underneath it, and then there's the flesh the skin with the flesh of the fish underneath it. So in order to get the scales off, you have to actually puncture the skin and rip it off. So that, l'kuli alma, no good. Now, this is the grace of Machlekes Rishonim, better barbuta fish that sounds similar, and there's major tumults in the Rishonim and Achronim exactly how to understand it. But the sterlit is different. The sterlit does not have that translucent layer of skin running on top of it. The sterlit is just very tightly connected. It's like the scales are super tightly connected to the fish. So comes the Neiv Yehuda, and the Neiv Yehuda says as follows. He says, Ve'ein loymar, don't tell me, Shashriya b'mayim azim hanal garim leishi yaklufu. It's the gugan that got the scales to come off. He says, Demapekach, seif, Syrian kaskasim hu levush. At the end of the day, its covering of kaskasim was a levush, because the fish is whole and the kaskasim are in the bucket. So it doesn't matter how I loosened it up, what I used to loosen it up. At the end of the day, it's a levush. It's something that comes off. He says, "V'guf hachumra shemtziu Rabbeinu Ramban b'pirish hatayra Parsha Shmini." The whole chumra that the Ramban introduced in Parsha Shmini, he says, "Shemeinim niklafim klal leinachash b'lesim tayra." That if it doesn't come off, this is the Neiv says, "Ilmale amra adam gadol yisidan kenegdai." If not that an adam gadol, the Ramban said it, I would, I don't know that I would agree with this chumra that the Ramban is saying. He says, "Imabakach shein niklafim." Doesn't say anywhere in the Gemara, not in Avodah Zarah, not in Chulin, not in Yerushalmi, not nowhere, that there's this t'nai, that if it doesn't come off, you can't eat it. Other Rabba, Mishnah Amru, Kaskasim Apuyim Bay. Says the Ramban is making up his own chumrah. If it was up to me, I'd be chaylik, he says. But Lamaisa Amnam, Midivir Rabbi Seinu Bali Atalmud Hayli Lahavi. Okay, he says, Lamaisa, it's a rishon. He says, Avama Esev Rabbeinu Agadol Ramban Amra. What can I do? It's Rabbeinu Agadol Ramban said this, so it's a chumrah that needs to be adhered to. Rava Magid brings it down, the Beis Yosef brings it down, and the Ramah paskins like it. So tzrichananu lachuf azneinu v'lishmaya divreim be'ema. What can I do? I have to bend my ear and just listen be'ema. I can't be chaylik. Avlo kapanim, he says, kol sheniklafim, as long as lemaisa it could come off, even if you have to use luge to get it off, you have to use some sort of method to loosen it up to get it off. Whatever is necessary to get it off. Kfarheim nikroim kaskasim v'dog tarhu. As I said, it's called kaskasim. It's kosher. This is a pretty hard sack from the Neiv Yehuda, pretty solid. He's not hedging. Now the Neiv Yehuda, this is like a pet peeve of the Neiv Yehuda. The Neiv Yehuda despises chumras that come not from Shas. Anything that has like a different source, the Neiv Yehuda has a very hard time dealing with, and he shows that in this tshuva. Although he maintains that one still has to shtaltzu to this Ramban, and he has a workaround. He says the Ramban that says that it has to be able to come off v'yad b'keli means b'chalif and shia. Whatever you use to loosen it up, that's good enough. Now, there are those, Talmidim the Neiv Yehuda, the Argadol and the Neiv Yehuda's son and the Tshuv Me'ava, they bring an interesting raya that the Ramban himself l'chayr had to hold like this. Because the Ramban, when he talks about a different fish, which I don't know what this fish is called today, the Ramban calls it a sturgeon, I don't know, maybe it's a variant of a sturgeon, it's hard to know what the Ramban is referring to. The Ramban says, the Ramban writes about himself that I was baidikit, v'sharais b'mayim, I was baidikit, I soaked it in hot water, v'nishtayir menu kaskasim, and I found in the bottom of the bucket some scales came loose. And then the Ramban says, "V'gam Rabbeinu Tam matir." And I heard that Rabbeinu Tam is matir about this fish also. And Rabbeinu Tam is taken in Tosfos in Avodah Zarah and Daf Mem talks about a fish like this in his matir. So you see, the Ramban himself writes that by a difficult fish where the scales were not easy to get off, the Ramban says, "I soaked it in water for several hours, and then I found scales came off." So say the Talmidim of the Rebbe Yehuda, Mali Gugan, Mali hot water. Hot water was another form of a solvent, of a loosening agent to get the scales to loosen their binding from the flesh of the fish. What the Rebbe Yehuda did, what the Ramban himself did. So clearly the Ramban meant that there is this carve out, there's this workaround, that if you're able to loosen it up, that you could get it out. Now this is the Rebbe Yehuda, and B'Shaitai, interestingly, the tshuva is dated, I think in 17, I'm going to go 1782, I think I remember. 1782 is the tshuva is dated. At the time, it made no controversy. The tshuva landed, it'll just plop, no controversy, nothing happened. In Tamashava, the city that he was writing to his Talmud, it seems that they started eating the sterlit fish. Everyone was eating sterlit. It wasn't a problem. Nothing happened. Almost 20 years later, 16 years later, there's a young Rav who we've talked about in the past, someone we've talked about in the past, Reb Aaron Charner. Aaron Charner, who later on went on to become a well-known, bad guy, who some Sefer went after, in the most extreme of ways, and who his own Rebbeim, Reb Moshe Mintz, and Rav Yirmi of Matastarf, and his own Rebbeim, were very done with him, and others wanted him to shave his beard and shave his head and be put on chayrim, etc. We talked about that other time. So later on, it was Nizgala Kleinei L'Rabbim, meaning everybody understood who Aaron Charner was. But at this point, Aaron Charner was in his, I think, 20s or 30s. He became a Rav at 22 years old in the city of Arad. In Arad, in the city of Arad, which is again Hungary. Today it's in Romania, I think, but it's in that same vicinity of Hungary. And in 16 years after this tshuva came out, in 1798, Aaron Charner, puts out a kuntras, a sefer called Imri Noyam, where he wants to be matir eating the tickfish. Now, tickfish is another kind of fish that the Rebbe Yehuda did not talk about, that he held was a similar zushtel to what the Rebbe Yehuda spoke about. It was similar to the situation of the Rebbe Yehuda. And he said, just like the Rebbe Yehuda was makel by the sterlit, we could extend that heter to the tickfish. And he held of this heter very stark as a young man, and he went to the fish market in Arad, where tick had never been a fish that was bought by Jewish people, and he bought, give me all your stock of tickfish. He brought it home, he prepared it, and he made a kiddush. Come on, come all, eat some tickfish with me, and like this, that it's serious, and we're being makel about the tickfish. Now, when a local Rav, someone older than him, by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber, who was a Rav in the town of Paksh. It's another Hungarian town. Today it's actually a little famous because Paks has the only nuclear reactor for energy in the city, in the country of Hungary. Hungary at some point was a Soviet satellite, so they built like nuclear power stations. The only power station that stayed in Hungarian hands was Paks. So Paks is a known city in Hungary, but the Rav of Paks, when it was a very small, unknown city in Hungary, was Ritzla Grishaber, who was a Talmud in the Rebbe Yehuda, who was very, very bothered by Aaron Charner's adopting of the Rebbe Yehuda's heter and extending the Rebbe Yehuda's heter, and he put out a contravening sefer called Makal Noyam with 64 simanim to totally destroy Aaron Charner's psak in Imrei Noyam. Now, it was like a terribly dirty fight. Basically, what happened is as follows: we have the letters all leading up to it, where Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber becomes aware of the psak of Rabbi Aaron Charner, and he writes him a letter as follows. He says, listen, I know you think you have a psak from the Rebbe Yehuda. It can't be so. It's not so. We have a Messiah not to eat these fish. It can't be so. And this is where it gets tricky. He goes out on a limb, and he says, and not only that is it not so, the Rebbe Yehuda wrote to me that he's chayzer. He wrote to me that he's chayzer from this psak. And this is the white lie, I guess, that got him caught up, and you'll see how this happens. He writes, to me the Rebbe Yehuda was chayzer. And he writes, it's not a big deal to be chayzer. The Rebbe Yehuda was chayzer other times, and he shows 2-3 other times where the Rebbe Yehuda was chayzer. And Rava in the Gemara says 10 times, it was a mistake. And the mashmayis of Lashon Toyis is that someone else corrected him. Not like Haderbei. The Gemara says Haderbei, he was chayzer. That means a person himself was chayzer, and while he's learning, he was chayzer. Toyis means he made a mistake, and someone else corrected you, and he made a mistake. He says it's not a big deal to make a mistake. Then he made a mistake. He was chayzer, he made a mistake. or maybe he wasn't sent the right fish, or it was already shriveled up by the time it got to him. Many different reasons, but the Maisa the Neidu was chayzer. So Aaron Charaner, because he was Aaron Charaner, instead of backing down and saying, I see the older Rabbanim in Hungary don't want this, are not comfortable with this psak, Aaron Charaner calls his bluff. And he sends a letter to the Neidu Bezdin in Prague, who has in their hand the first edition of the Neshut Neidu. The Neidu is dead already, but they have all the letters that comprise they have the archives of the Neidu Bezdin. And he sends them a letter and he says, would you please just educate me, if you could please, send me a copy of the exact language of the Neidu tshuva, in its original, unedited format, being makel for the sturgeon. And also, if you don't mind, just send me a copy of the tshuva where he was chayzer from it later on. To which Reb Shmuel Landau, who was now the Bezdin, the son of the Neidu Yehuda, and the Tshuva Me'aver of Eliezer Fleckels, who was on the Bezdin, write back that, no. They send him a copy of the letter that was sent to Tamashov, being makel. And in regards to the Chazara, they say no. That's I'm going to read you Reb Shmuel Landau's words. He's not pleased. Shmuel Landau writes as follows. He says, I'm holding the Tshuvas, he says. And now, this is a letter that he's writing to Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber in Paksh, actually. This is not the letter to Aaron Charaner, but he writes, V'tamani, shekasiv ma'alase, she'adoni avi meri v'rabi ha'goinzal, hadr be'mehira azos. You wrote that that my father was chayzer from this. V'tziva al ma'alase, and he was mitzvah you, Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber, l'shleach igeres ha'adron l'harav mitamashov. And he gave you the job to forward the letter to the Rav of Tamashov, who he had originally sent the heter to. Yimchali ma'alase, he says, with all due respect. Nothing good comes after that. With all due respect, he says, Shedavazehu sheker muchlet. It's a bold-faced lie. This is what the Neidu the son writes. He says, Yimchali, with all due respect, it's a bold-faced lie. V'yadua l'chol, gadol tzidkasi shel admar hagoyin zal. Everybody knows what a Yirei Shemayim and a tzaddik my father was. V'yamahir v'zaraz b'malachas haksiva. For him to write a tshuva was lickety-split. He could bang out a tshuva in a few minutes. It was nothing. He got shy. When it came to being chayzer from this psak, he got shy. He told you to write to him, to tell him. The whole thing was lost. It says the Rav of Tamashavar was very close to my father. Actually, we happen to know that the Rav of Tamashavar was Reb Shmuel Landau's tutor as a kid growing up. When Reb Shmuel Landau was a boy, the Neidu had the Melamed who learned with him was the future Rav of Tamashavar, who was the Shail in the Shaila. Says he was very close. They had a good relationship. He could have told him over the many years that he was chayzer from the Sirah. He wouldn't have allowed you to be his messenger. Now, the problem is that Shmuel Landau didn't just write this to Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber, he wrote it to Aaron Charaner also. Now, Aaron Charaner is in possession. Now, what happens is Aaron Charaner really called Yitzchak Grishaber's bluff. He's in possession of the original letter of the Neidu Yehuda saying that it's mutter. He now knows that l'chayra, and I'll say it respectfully the way that Tzitz Eliezer says it, that l'chayra there is no letter being chayzer. Tzitz Eliezer says we can't conclusively rule out that Yitzchak Grishaber was lying. Can't say for sure that he was lying. Maybe Shmuel Landau didn't know about it. It's possible. But Aaron Charaner is now armed with everything he needs. He knows the Neidu Yehuda said the heter, and he knows the Neidu Yehuda did not make the chazara. So he goes, and instead of backing down, he digs in. So now Yitzchak Grishaber tries again, and he writes to his Rebbeim. He writes to Moshe Mintz, the Rav of Alt Afen, it's another Hungarian town, and he writes to Rabbi Yirmi of Matastarf, who's now the Rav of Santiv. He's referred to as Agoyin Misantiv, and he writes to the Santiver and to Moshe Mintz, and he asks him, please, lean on your Talmud, tell him to be chayzer. And we have the letters, because they both were glad to publish them. Everyone involved in this fight graciously published everything from all the sides, and in it, their first letters are very nice. They're like, listen, you're not saying something wrong, it's okay, but Lamaisa, the Gedolei Rabbanim over here, the Maram Mint, the Maram Banet, who is much older than you, and the Yitzchak Grishaber, and they don't want this psak to be in Hungary. They don't agree with this psak. So even if you think you have a psak, just back down, and it's not, you're talking about a man in his high 20s. Aaron Charaner was in his high 20s at this time. A young man. Just back down. You don't have to make your bones on this. You could back down and walk away. Digs in. Every letter you see the digging happen more and more. There's 64 letters back and forth in Makal Noyam. Imri Noyam has more. There's an endless amount of letters. It involved, I think, close to 40 Rabbanim when all was said and done. Rabbanim of every... These are tiny little dot towns, but each one of them had a Rav was Tam Chacham. I wrote down a small list. The Rav of Galant, the Rav of Makiveh, the Rav of Tamashava, the Rav of Ara, the Rav of Santiv, Pax, Pupa, Ser Deheli. The Chasam Sofer got involved. The Maram Banet got involved. Reb Shmuel Landau, the Tshuva Me'ava, the Shvus Yaakov, an endless amount of Rabbanim. 40 Rabbanim wrote Tshuvas, back and forth on all sides of this fight. Most of them, at least the Hungarian batch, were encouraging Aaron Charner to back down, walk away from this psak. Don't dig in on this psak, walk away from this psak. Instead, he puts out Imrei Noyam, strongly standing to this psak. So then Ritzl Grishaber publishes his rebuttal, Makal Noyam, with all the letters of people being chaylik on him. And then, instead of backing down after that, Aaron Charner puts out a sefer called Syrian Kaskasim, which is doubling down on his doubling down, to argue in Ritzl Grishaber and say, no, this is a psak, I didn't make it up, it's the Neidav Yehuda. And at the whole time, he does this artfully, I have to give him credit, very artfully, hides behind protecting the covenant of the Neidav Yehuda. The whole thing is about how could you say something bad about the Neidav Yehuda? How could you say that it was Chayzer, my Rebbe, Klal Yisrael's Rebbe, the Pesach Hadar? It's all artfully hiding behind protecting the covenant of the Neidav Yehuda. And Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber was a Talmud of the Neidav Yehuda. At no time, Chas v'Shalom says the Neidav Yehuda is wrong, or he's arguing the Neidav Yehuda. He was well aware that he's not a bar plukta with the Neidav Yehuda. He just maintains his storyline. Neidav Yehuda was Chayzer. Neidav Yehuda was Chayzer in this psak, and that's it. Now, incidentally, a lot of the letters that Hungarian Rabbanim wrote about it, they were under the premise that Rabbi Yitzchak Grishaber was telling the absolute truth. They had not seen, the back and forth. He told them the Neidav Yehuda was Chayzer. He said, I'm willing to make a shvuah about it, which is what the Tzitz Eliezer uses to say that you can't conclusively say he's lying, because people don't throw around the term, I'm willing to make a shvuah, easily. That's not something you do with great ease. He says, so they were samech on that. He was telling them that there was a chazara, and they didn't, and each one stood on their side. Now, incidentally, the Chassam Sofer did not write a shuvah. The Chassam Sofer was about the same age as Aaron Charner. He was a young man. He was 30 years old. He didn't write a shuvah about this. But in his drushes that he gave a speech in Pressburg many years later, and in his Chedushim HaMasechtas Chulin, he references this fight, and he says, V'gam daiti is kedasa oisrim, and he tells the people in Pressburg in the speech, he says, and it's aleichem to listen to me, because you're my mispalim, so I don't care what you heard on the street. This one says this, I'm telling you what I hold, you have to listen to me. And many years later, in the later fights with Aaron Charner that we've addressed earlier on, when the Chassam Sofer writes about Aaron Charner, he writes, and those who knew he was bad from the get-go. He says, because he fought with all the Gedolei Rabbanim when it came to the sturgeonfish and the tickfish. So Chassam Sofer was like Noiter Kina. He remembered that back in the day, even though Chassam Sofer was young, he wasn't really involved in that fight so much. He remembers he was Noiter Kina this fight. Now, so I just want to say one nakud over here. The problem is that Al Pi Pashtus, the Neidav Yehuda did say that you could be makel about the sterlit fish. When all the dust settles, when all the tshuvas have done flying back and forth, and all the name calling is done, and Gerech that Aaron Charner was a bad guy and should have backed down, and he didn't shtaltzu to the Gedolei Rabbanim of Hungary. But Lamais, the Neidav Yehuda was makel about this. And the Shvus Yaakov, and the Shoyel Meshiv, and the Beis Hillel, and many, first-rate Gedolei HaPoskim were taka makel about this. And even so, the narrative became that this is a kula that somehow, like Kishkaga Yetzim Piashalat, this is not a kula that was meant to be either the way the Maram Banet, who was, an older Rav, who was a contemporary of the Neidav Yehuda, writes, like, it's a mistake, it's an Atzasa Yetzer, meaning they fooled him, they sent him the wrong fish, they did the wrong Atzasa Yetzer. It can't be a real psak, meaning the Maram Banet was aware that it's Yitachan that the Neidav Yehuda did make this psak, and the Chazar is not real, but he says Atzasa Yetzer, it can't be. Or others who say that it was the wrong fish, or it was too dried out, the conditions were wrong, or etc. Meaning, everyone has to give an excuse to justify how they're being madche, what's l'chayra mefurish tshuva in the Neidav Yehuda, that in the next bunch of pages, Neidav Yehuda's son and his talmidim defend it to the hilt. They stand by this tshuva all the way. So I just wanted to say an interesting thought. I think it's a true thing. We know this from Yaakov Avinu already by Ani Becharcha, Ani Esav Becharcha, right? We know about lying. We know lying is not so black and white. Meaning, what I'll say is like this: like Aaron Charner was telling the truth as narrowly defined. There's a psak from the Neidav Yehuda that says X, and he thinks it could be applied to this case, and there was no chazar from the Neidav Yehuda. Narrowly defined, he was telling the truth. But in the overall scheme of things, what he was doing is he was using a one-off psak from the Neidav Yehuda that was, a real eyebrow-raising psak that needed to be figured out exactly the context and the circumstance and etc., and was using it to drive the narrative of Reformation, reform, and conservative, and undoing rabbinic, Yiddishkeit, which was his life's goal, as we came to know over the tkufa of his life. He was using it to drive that narrative. So while the words that were coming out of his mouth were the truth, he was using it to drive a false narrative. It was not a narrative the Neidav Yehuda was on board for. He was using it to drive a different narrative, as opposed to, let's say, Ritzler Grishaber, who in the most narrow definition of truth wasn't telling the truth, in all its ways. He was bending the truth, but he was telling the truth. The narrative that he was pushing about sticking to the Messiah and sticking to the psak of the Gedolei Rabbanim and backing down when the Gedolei Rabbanim tell was the truth. So maybe I'm using the wrong words, for truth and falsehood, but there's a lot of examples of this, and I'll share one of them. The Magen Avram in Siman Kuf Nun Vav in Archaim, when he brings down the Isser to lie, he brings the Gemara Pesachim. The Gemara Pesachim Daf Kuf Yud Beis says, Rabbi Akiva tells Reb Shimon ben Yochai, Roitzel Yichanik, if you want to hang yourself, Hitale be'ilan gadol, hang yourself from a big tree, which according to some Rishonim means as follows: if you want to say a psak that is not going to be niskabel, because you're just not going to hear it from you. But if you say that I once heard b'shem Reb Moshe that X, Y, and Z is aser or mutter, they'll listen to you. So Roitzel Yichanik, you want to hang yourself on a psak on someone else, Hitale be'ilan gadol, hang yourself on a big tree, which is just good advice. Meaning you want to lie and say like, this psak that I made up really is thing, so just say it's Reb Moshe, say it's Rabbi Yashiv. Don't say, I was once schmoozing with a Rav and he told me, say it's a big paisik and then people are going to trust you. That's the Eitzah. Now, the problem is, that's great advice for lying, but you're lying. Rabbi Akiva is giving Reb Shimon ben Yochai advice on how to lie. He's telling him how to lie. That's what he's telling him. So, the Magen Avram brings stiris, sheker so important. But Lamaisi says, we paskin like this Gemara, the Magen Avram says. We paskin like this Gemara, and what it means is that a psak that is the truth, meaning a psak that needs to get out there. The psak has to get out there. People have to know this psak. But you don't have the standing to promulgate this psak, to get this psak across. Hitale bil and gadol. Just say someone else bigger than you said it and let the psak get out. A psak that you know is the truth, it has to get out, so you could lie. And what the Magen Avram and what the Gemara essentially is telling you is that's not a lie. Advancing the proper goals, getting to the right outcome, kilu, the ends justify the means, so to speak. And none other than the Chassam Sofer himself, in a tshuva, in Chelik Vav, someone writes to the Chassam Sofer that his reputation is in tatters, and people are ganging up on him, they're saying he made the wrong psak, and they're saying the wrong thing. First, the Chassam Sofer gives him chizik about being a Rav. The Chassam Sofer says, listen, if people don't like you, you're in the wrong business. Of course, it's not just Amaratzim are going to like you, it's the Talmidei Chacham are going to hate you even more. Because they're going to have all sorts of learned critique on you, and etc. Don't worry. He says, V'yisim Nikiyim just means try your best. It doesn't mean you could actually, perfectly get everything clean. It says, V'oid, says the Chassam Sofer, even if sometimes you have to trim a corner to get the outcome you need, he says, Ayin Magen Avram and the Gemara Pesachim, who says this, he says, and if you're able, he says, it's a rare sefer, if you're able to find them at Pacha Seferim from the Yavitz, Ayin Mashakasav Hanavi Zal, he calls the Yavitz a Navi. Look what the Navi Zal wrote, where the Yavitz also writes that many things that are accepted as basic fact are really just Reitzeli Talam Bilan Gadol. They're things that someone hung on someone else to make the psak stick, and that's it. So essentially what's going on over here is the truth is a lie and the lie is a truth, which makes life a little complicated. I'll just say Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in Al HaTorah, by the story of Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov has such a simple mashal. He says, imagine you're standing outside and you see a murderer chasing his potential victim, gun in hand. He rounds the corner, he tucks himself behind your garbage can, and a second later the murderer runs around the corner and he says, is he behind the garbage can? He says, what's the truth now? In this moment, what's midvashak? What midvashak is mechayev from you what? You're supposed to say, right there. Behind the green one, a little to the left, because it's exactly the truth. We say, no, I haven't seen him. I think he went that way. He says, it's pashut to everyone. Everyone understands. You're supposed to say he went that way. Right? Now, it's not the truth. He says, sometimes the truth is not the truth, and sometimes a lie is not a lie. Now, this is something that the Rabbi Yerucham says it, the Maral says it, the Chazon Ish and the Munu B'tachon says it. Each one says it in their own words, and possibly my words are still inartful. Maybe lie and truth are not the right words. You have to figure out what the exact way to say it. But this is a classic case where truth didn't mean one thing. Truth meant different things to different people in this context. L'maisa, the psak of the Marambanet, and not like the Noid Yehuda, is the psak that's stuck. And today nobody eats the sterlit fish anymore. But this is a fascinating case study in truth in halacha.
Yeah. Why would grasshopper not be in? Grasshopper not be in? Yeah.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.